Greetings and welcome to another episode of Safety is Redacted. I am your host, Matt, and today I am joined by Cassie from Thorn.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm going to skip ahead slightly and just say you were the head of communications at Thorn, and we've gotten to work in that capacity together a few times, which I've really enjoyed immensely. But share a little bit, what else do folks need to know about you and your career to understand your work?
My official title is the Director of Communications and Thought Leadership at Thorn. Thorn, in case you're not familiar with it, is a nonprofit that transforms the way children are protected from sexual abuse and exploitation in the digital age. So we help platforms detect child sexual abuse material, identify victims faster, improve online safety systems, things like that. And in my role, I focus a lot on translating super complex, sensitive work like this into communication that people can actually understand. So that involves whether it's talking to the press and giving journalists background on this issue or, on Thorn in general, or really paying attention to the public discourse and how people are talking about trust and safety and child safety, and thinking about how we can talk about it in ways that move the needle. And also on the opposite end, like the things that people are talking about in this field that kind of have the opposite effect and can inadvertently be somewhat destructive to the work that we all do in this space. So I'm not a hands-on trust and safety practitioner, but I spend a lot of time trying to understand the people who do that work so that I can kind of serve as a bridge between the trust and safety community and the way people understand some of the most pressing issues that they all work on.
Yeah, and you hit on something really important. This is incredibly sensitive and demanding and oftentimes emotionally and conceivably traumatic work. I know others who have been much more in the weeds. We think about law enforcement and others who spend a lot of time. Someone has to look at this content, even if it is going into AI, and figure out what's going on. But I think, too, the thing you hit on is understanding what this work is. That's the whole mission of this podcast is how do we do a better job of talking about trust and safety and what it actually does? Because the misconceptions have been so high these past few years of how do we keep people safe online? Why does that matter? And how do you create spaces that people feel that they want to belong and can be safe and sort of do the things that help connect us as a community and share our passions and play games we love and all that other fun stuff that happens within that.
And I think one of the biggest barriers in telling these stories in a way that actually makes sense and helps people wrap their heads around the complexities of trust and safety and what this field really is that either some of these stories don't seem interesting to the media, or the media tries really hard to sort of sensationalize some of this and kind of over indexes in that way. So really trying to walk that line where, this work is interesting and worth covering and worth talking about, but doing it in a way that is accurate and helps people really understand the challenges and wrap their head around what's going on in the trust and safety world and what it takes to keep platforms safe. It's a constant balance.
When people hear platform safety, what do they usually misunderstand and what do you wish that they knew instead?
I think when I think about the press and the general public, I know the trust and safety audience who is listening to this podcast, this is not going to be mind-blowing to them. They understand this, but the general public, I think, tends to think that safety is either yes or no, or safety is a switch that a platform flips on or off, or they care about safety or they don't, right? People who either are trust and safety practitioners or people like me who are very close to it is the threats that are evolving, the challenges that you all are facing. It is so complex and so nuanced. And I think that the public discourse and the press coverage often misses this level of nuance that it really takes to tell these stories right. The other thing that I constantly contend with as somebody in communications in this space is that there's an issue with sort of proving a negative, right? It's impossible to prove a negative. So it's hard to show all the harm that didn't happen. And it's hard to show all of the abuse that was prevented, all of the child sexual abuse and exploitation issues that were prevented on a platform because of a good practice, or the content, the harmful, horrible, egregious content that users never see. A lot of that work is invisible. So how do you tell a story and prove that negative and have people understand that a lot of the work that goes in is to do that, and it's not ever going to be seen?
No, and something else we've talked about before is it's never going to be seen and it's never going to be going away. We're just constantly trying to get better at preventing it from being seen in the first place, right? And understanding that I don't think what you hit on is fascinating to me and try to explain is I don't think people are aware of how much they do not see on a given day, how much content is taken down before it even hits the interwebs and gets in front of a human person. I mean, that number is pretty exponential.
Totally. And I feel like you really only hear about something in a major way in
Mhm.
mainstream media or to the general public in those forums when something breaks or when something does go wrong. And just because of the sheer volume and amount of work that's done in the space, of course things are going to break and of course they're going to go wrong. But if those are the only stories that we're focusing on and telling from a
Mhm.
journalist or a media perspective, then you're missing a lot of the really telling the stories of the really good and important work that also exposes the challenges that, and kind of gives the general public some understanding of just how complex this all is.
The last thing I just know from working with professionals, when all you see in the news is everything that didn't work, it can be incredibly disheartening because the folks that are doing this work care a lot and almost to a fault. And trying to keep that encouragement of like, oh no, you managed to reduce harm by this much. And it's usually a small percent, but it's a significant number within that small percent. And so trying anything to kind of encourage this work to continue and to keep on happening and just not to get disheartened that you are or are not making an impact is something that's incredibly important to the professionals in this space, and just trying to keep encouraging them to keep on keeping on, as it were.
Yeah, it's almost hard for me to admit. I've only been in this, in this trust and safety space for about 5 years. So I can easily remember my own misconceptions and my own biases before I really had a full understanding. So my first year at TrustCon, we would I probably shouldn't even admit this, but whatever. We would be at this conference all day and I'd be hearing about all these egregious issues on these platforms and how we handle them. And I came in with this knowledge from my own experiences on social media and what I knew about social media and platforms and things like that, thinking, God, these are also, these platforms are also horrible. But then when you really work here, you realize at almost every single platform and tech company you can imagine,
Mhm.
there's an army of trust and safety people behind the scenes who are making ridiculously complex
Mhm.
decisions every day and that care so much about getting it right and that they've invested their entire career in
Yeah.
trying to do this. And now that I'm on this side and I get that, I find it to be a huge responsibility of mine that I look at and say, I need to help tell these stories and make sure that people understand, the complexities of it because it's not inherently understood by the general public. And I was a member of that general public not too long ago. So
No, that's a transition as we talk about, telling good stories. One of the biggest things that tech is tried to do, some success, some not so much success, is transparency.
mhm.
And so in your opinion, and you've been doing comms for a very long time and on multiple levels. So I'd be curious to get your take. Like, what does good transparency look like in practice? Like, we know it's more than just a blog post that says, hey, we take this seriously, but something actionable. So yeah, what does good transparency look like and what can platforms do to kind of sort of show, repair, and tell that story as you're referencing?
Yeah, and I love a good transparency report. I feel like a lot of people in trust and
Isn't it the
safety.
best?
Yes, like when you see a good transparency report, you're like, yes, thank you for this because it's specific and it's
Mhm.
measurable. And it's not just every platform can say, look, we care about safety. We care a lot about safety. Saying out loud or in a transparency report that you care about safety is not the same as here's how many reports we received this year. Here's how we responded. Here's where we fell short, which I think, a lot of platforms have a long way to go in being
Mhm.
that level of transparent. But I really respect the ones who are like, this is what went wrong and this is what we learned from it. So sometimes you see a platform come out and say that. And that to me is like a really strong mark of transparency. And if a responsible journalist is doing their work correctly, then they will give that the right cushion and context around it that does the
Mhm.
platform justice, right? And really shows why this transparency is necessary and why this isn't just something negative for the platform to say about themselves or admitting what a platform doesn't necessarily know yet, acknowledging that we haven't solved every single safety issue. Here's where we're still falling short. Here's what we want
Mhm.
to do next year, next quarter, whatever it is to address that. So, really just rising above that surface level and sharing as much as now I think about what it would look like if I was on a communications team at a platform. I haven't played that role yet in my life. I don't know if that I ever will, but I can also feel the friction, right? Like, what does it look like for a platform to admit some of their shortcomings? What does it look like when the numbers don't add up to what you are hoping to show in terms of the safety on your platform? So it's not so straightforward. It's not easy for platforms to be this transparent, but we truly need it. And I think what's missing there is that communications bridge, that cushion, a context around it that really helps
Mhm.
people understand the full picture. So it's not just a negative press story or something negative that a platform is reporting about itself. It is actual real transparency with context.
And that's the biggest frustration I hear, back to your point we're talking about where trust and safety professionals just feel deflated, right? Because it's only the negative thing. And I think there's a sense of just almost burnout of like, hey, here's everything you're doing wrong. And it's like, well, we kind of already know that. Like, we sort of know what's not working. But there's, can you help us understand what is going right? Like, bring me a solution. Don't continue to point at what isn't working. And I think there's a balance to that sentiment. But yes, I love what you shared about telling the story better. There's so many data points. There's so much information of, if we remove 92% of a certain type of content and now it's 92.5, or maybe this new behavior emerged, or there was a social trend and now we have this new policy to address that trend as it comes up. Even just understanding how AI is being used, telling that story is so important. So in any service that you engage with, you kind of know what you're getting into and you know how your data is being used and to what purpose and things that are happening. I know one of the ones you and I connected on was looking at Anthropic and what they were doing with their service. And they had the fraud attack and just understanding of like, hey, here's what happened. Here's what we know what they did. Here's how we're going to prevent this in the future. And it's just a really good example of like, hey, we know something happened. Here are the details as we understand it. And here's what we're trying to do to respond to.
And no platform is perfect, but Anthropic always sits with me as such a good example of an organization that has stuck by their values, has prioritized safety from the beginning, and is really transparent about the opportunities, the challenges, the failures. And they come forward and they produce these incredible reports and blog posts and explainer videos and things like that to help the general public understand not only what's happening at Anthropic and where the safety issues are, where the opportunities are, but what it means for the broader AI and tech ecosystem so that other platforms can kind of learn from that. And I mean, whether or not they apply those practices and learnings is up to them. But I just think if more organizations and companies were like that, then the whole ecosystem would be stronger and safer and more user-friendly. And if, the media and other like tech influencers and things like that were telling those stories as well and telling them holistically, then we'd be in a much better place than we are now with transparency.
Yeah, and it's exciting to see where it has come because I can tell you 10 plus years ago when I would start, advising platforms or coming in and learning as an outside stakeholder, one of the most common things I would hear is, oh, we don't want to share that publicly because then the bad actors would get it and then they'll learn how to exploit it. We saw TikTok was kids getting hurt. And kids getting hurt, we discovered was part of a listening trend to kind of breadcrumb or lead to other content. And so when I see the people laugh, I'm like, oh, look at that kid. He fell off his bike or whatever, and be like, oh, well, you know what that is. But again, if you don't know, you don't know. And in that case, I would argue ignorance is bliss. So it's not sharing in order to educate bad actors is still part of it, though, particularly as we think about how people are trying to evade detection and what that is. So as we think about where's the line between being transparent and sharing too much, where do you kind of see sort of that balance that really could to prevent bad actors from trying to evade detection because now they know what a platform is doing or how it's doing it?
Yeah, I think about this all the time at Thorn, and from the top at Thorn, we've always thought about this because we don't want to accidentally help bad actors evade systems. We don't want to help, people who are looking to exploit or abuse kids do it at scale or do it, have easier ways to do it. So I think finding that balance is going to be different for every single organization, every platform, but being transparent basically about what you're doing and why you're doing it, but being careful about how your systems work. And, that again, that looks different for everybody, but maybe it's like we use AI powered detection tools, right? But I think, finding that balance is obviously super important. And I think that nobody's going to get it perfect. Certainly nobody's gotten it perfect yet. So
As part of that balance, platforms have to decide what they want to share and why. So when do you think platforms are being hesitant or might be hesitant, particularly years past and certainly now, to discuss these efforts openly? And as things change, what are some contexts that are sort of making them resistant to putting stuff out publicly?
Yeah, well, first of all, there's never been more pressure on platforms, public pressure, in my opinion. I feel like there's never been more public pressure on platforms to explain themselves and come forward and discuss their safety practices. And at the same time, the tech is changing so quickly that it makes that really difficult, right? But I also think this question is kind of two-part. Platforms historically being hesitant to discuss safety openly is a little bit different from trust and safety professionals being hesitant to talk about these issues. And I talk about these two things all the time. And I talk a lot about the trust and safety community and whether or not they should be coming forward to talk about these issues on their platforms, whether or not they should speak publicly, whether they have a responsibility. I personally think they do not, but that's, up for debate among many people to sort of expose some of these platform safety issues that they see happening every day. But it's obviously all become more intense with increased scrutiny on these platforms, the AI race, public pressure, like I said, legal concerns, and, whether you decide to say a lot, a little, or nothing, complete silence doesn't really seem to be an option anymore. So, yeah.
The AI race, I think, really escalated things from a regulatory standpoint. If we think about the whole effort, 15 years ago, move faster, break things. And then it became, oh no, safety by design. We understand what's going on. And then the AI boom, which it's only been like 3 years from in terms of like public consumption. And now it feels like we're back in the move fast and break things without a strong regard for these, more than 10 years of knowledge of what safety looks like in online spaces. And so, yeah, doing nothing is no longer an option for sure.
Right. And if anybody was at TrustCon last year, we had a conversation on stage with a couple of journalists and some comms professionals about just this like state of transparency between platforms and trust and safety professionals and the media. And it is kind of still a little bit of a mess. It's tricky.
Yeah.
There are a lot of reasons why trust and safety professionals don't feel comfortable speaking out.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of reasons why platforms tend to hide safety issues and maybe just provide either a talking head or a PR person or a C-suite exec with very tight talking points to discuss these things, because it is so high stakes from a legal perspective, from an investor perspective. All of these huge AI platforms are talking about sort of, going public very soon, and the stakes have never been higher for them. So how do we get these stories told when there are so much red tape, so many red flags for people to speak out? And that's what I try to do, is build that bridge, just, casually.
Well, especially on the trust and safety side, I know so many individuals, professionals who end up becoming targets because they wrote a policy or enforced a decision, or because they were the figurehead. In the gaming side, it's like, oh, we added this new feature and the public hated it. And all of a sudden they became the target. I have several friends who ended up in FBI custody because of threats made against them, all because of their enforcement in a game or social platform. So when you think about personal stakes being very high, I think there's a lot of folks who are choosing not to be public about their experiences just to prevent from becoming that type of target.
Totally. And I'm going into, sorry to keep bringing TrustCon up, but it's, it's on my mind right now. And I'm going into TrustCon this year with a very specific mission in my mind, which is, what are some of the ways that we can help get these stories told without trust and safety people being whistleblowers or quitting their jobs or like holding up the megaphone and saying, this is wrong, because I personally, some people in the world might disagree with me. I think that the majority of people working on trust and safety issues at platforms, they have enough on their plates. They are dedicating their career and their time to making these platforms as safe as possible. They're responding to constant regulatory pressure, right? And having to comply, compliance issues and things like that. And then, on top of everything else from a proactive safety lens that they want to be working on. Can we realistically expect them to risk even more by going out there publicly? And some might choose to do that, and some have chosen to do that. And that is amazing when they do. And what can we do? And when I say we, I mean, like, where are all my communications people at? Where are all the other people at these organizations who are not working on these trust and safety issues hands-on day in and day out to help these stories get told and to help kind of expose some of these safety issues and the opportunities that surround them without sacrificing the jobs and livelihoods and lives of the people who we actually count on to, actually do that work. And it's not easy. It's not an easy problem to solve, but that's the conversation that's really in my brain right now.
No, that's a big lift. Staying with that thread, if a platform could only share, 3 things with the public, particularly around building trust, because we know that's a big challenge with tech right now. What should those things be and why?
Yeah, I think it's about sort of like the biggest risks that the platform faces and what they're doing about them. So can they show that they've addressed their threat landscape, that they know what their threat landscape is, that they have a really big, wholehearted picture of what that is and that they're addressing it, that they understand the vulnerabilities in that threat landscape, and that, like we were talking about earlier, generic safety statements don't actually build trust and they don't actually make things safer on a platform, right? I'd also love to see them show how they measure success, what that looks like for them. So again, sharing metrics, just like tracking everything and sharing those outcomes.
Hmm.
And then what actually happens when something goes wrong? And this is the hard part, right? This is what we're saying Anthropic does really well and does, as a practice, a really standard practice. So walk people through your incident response, walk people through escalation processes when you can, when you're able to. And this is what I think kind of builds trust. And this is an interesting story when you do it right for the media to pick up on, for the general public to understand that actually has legs and gets told. Because otherwise, I think you're looking at burying these safety issues and there's no story there, or a complete overblown sensationalization, if that's a word, of the issues and safety issues that are happening
Hmm.
on a platform. So it's a line to walk.
But a line that is very valuable. I mean, I can tell you from my time at TikTok, I was fortunate to be on the team and work on the early transparency reports. If you go back and look at the first transparency report, it's basically just a page declaring platform values. It just right after Musically became TikTok and like, here's what we're going to do. And then each quarter there was a publication. But every conversation of what do we put in the report and why is everything you and I just discussed, these past 20 minutes of, what is the data? What is the story it tells, how do we give it context? So it's not just, hey, here's a number, but here's what that number means when you connect it with these other data points. And so there's a lot of intentional effort, but at the end of it, by telling that story, by acknowledging we don't have this tool yet, but we're going to build it, and then getting that out into the public and notifying others. If you think about gateways for apps, like almost every app is on some kind of store platform, whether it's Apple or Google, and being able to have individuals who can access and then download your app. Most of these apps are ad revenue driven, particularly social media apps. And so being able to go to the advertisers and so like, hey, our platform is safe. Here's what we're doing for that, and being able to tell the story to those groups, because brands, are way more risk averse than many platforms can be and creators can be. And so being able to tell, to your point, tell that story so well, and to have all of those elements sort of working together, that level of trust and transparency, and like, hey, here's everything we're trying to do to the best of our effort that either is at or beyond what everyone else in the industry is doing, goes a long way to helping that app succeed, to earn additional money, and ergo be able to reinvest back into safety and the tooling that they're doing.
Totally. You just touched on something else that we've been talking a lot about. You can't walk into a room with trust and safety people these days, I feel like, or be at a conference without hearing about, how trust and safety is not a cost center, how it's actually an opportunity. Yeah. So we've been talking a lot about that at Thorn, and, I host our Safe Space podcast, and I've been hosting our Safe Space podcast, and every single guest that we have had on has touched on this. And when you're talking about advertisers and brands that you're going to associate with your platform and the safety practices on your platform, they want to associate themselves with a safe brand. So it's not a new conversation, certainly, but I think we're making progress there. And that goes a long way with storytelling around trust and safety as well. And just sort of myth busting around trust and safety and giving trust and safety the platform it deserves.
No, that's such a great point, because then this is a safe brand is sort of valuable, because that comes back to several things we've touched on, right? Like, hey, what is our value as a platform? Or what are our values as a platform? How do we communicate that externally? And then what do we do on a daily basis to live up to that? One of my favorite lines, I was a leadership teacher at high school for many years before this. And one of the things we always talked about is leadership is action. And it's one thing to say that these are our values versus these are our values and here's how we're living up to it. And that comes out in a transparency report. It comes out in actions and the reports and stuff that you do in the platform itself and the enforcements consistently. There's so many different layers that kind of build into that trust itself. So there's a lot of good points in that one. I think that one's going to end up as a reel.
We will see.
So, I mean, we talked a lot about platforms and others in terms of having their responsibility. What should consumers, creators, and parents look for to tell whether a platform's safety transparency is meaningful versus performative? What are the signals that we can kind of pick up on to help us understand what's really going on?
Yeah. And I think if I were somebody who was, in charge of sort of like polishing up and putting out a transparency report, I would try to remember that the people reading this report are humans, and they will pick up on these things that are performative and kind of marketing language. But to me, it's very obvious when there's vague language or you're kind of cherry picking stats and putting them together to tell a story, that the fact that is like, if there's missing context or you're only talking about, I see this a lot right now, that you're only talking about safety during bad press cycles, like your platform, I'm not naming any right now, but there have been a couple platforms that are constantly in the media right now for, really egregious harms, whether that's, I pay a lot of attention to the harms to kids, obviously, just based on my
Mhm.
job, but safety issues generally. And then all of a sudden, they're coming out with all these new transparency reports and new collaborations with nonprofits and new pages on their site that helps parents or whatever it is. But the timing of them is sometimes suspicious. So you got to
Mhm.
kind of look at the content of these things that they're putting out and say, like, is it specific and is it really addressing what you've been in the news for, or is this kind of like a shiny package that you're handing
Mhm.
to the general public and hoping that they see it when it's really just kind of performative? So also, who is a platform putting out there to speak about their safety issues? Is it only somebody who's been prepped and polished with really good PR talking points? Are trust and safety practitioners, if they want to be involved as well, are
Mhm.
those, execs or talking heads or whoever the platform puts out? Is it clear that they've actually talked to their trust and safety teams and they're delivering in the media or whatever the platform is that they're speaking on information that feels like real, that, like we got this information because we have this brilliant team of trust and safety people who are working on this issue every day. And here's what they've told me. It's not always easy to tell, but there are
Yeah.
some cues that I think, you can kind of sniff out because these are humans talking to humans. And we just, sometimes you can just tell.
No, you can totally pick up on when you're at a conference and someone's on a panel or a fireside chat, and there's certain types of language or the way they answer questions or redirect questions. You're just like, oh yeah, they're on script. Like this is totally the talking points that comms has approved, and you're like, all right, this is going to be their fluff piece. But yeah, I think the ability to be real about it, the ability to acknowledge something didn't work versus something is working, and what they're doing about it. Those are some great indicators. I'm curious if it's the same for you. I always get asked like, hey, my kid wants to do or use this app. Is it safe? And I'm like, well, I don't know. Like, what does safe mean to you? And just trying to help them understand, like, well, I read this news article. Okay, well, what did the news article say? And then really try to break down what it is they're understanding and the reality of like, oh, is there risk for XYZ versus is this just a really bad space and my kid shouldn't be there at all?
It's a combination of things just like that. The other thing I see a lot is some platforms will put out like researchers talking about,
Mm.
or interpretability people from the platform talking about the inner workings. And to some people that might be boring, but if you're willing to kind of expose the inner workings of how your platform works by sharing somebody, they're kind of pulling back the curtain and giving you the
Mm-hmm.
technical background of what's going on. To me, that's super valuable, but it's hard. Look, I want to have empathy for the comms and PR people inside a platform because in some cases, I'm sure,
Mm-hmm.
you're watching all of this happen and all these egregious safety issues happen on a platform. And it is your job to protect the image of the platform, right? So
Yeah.
these are, I'm not saying that should be done at the expense of exposing, but it's hard. This is not an easy climate that we're in right now in the AI race in the state of tech. So I try to befriend and talk to a lot of comms people at platforms because it's interesting to me to see how they function. And it's interesting to have conversations about what they can do to tell these
Mm-hmm.
stories in a way that does sort of protect the platform's reputation while giving a real look into the safety practices on a platform.
Just having the conversation. I mean, across the board, whether it's with comms people, certainly from the tech side, we've been having a lot of conversations just with regulators, in Take's case, how are games made? Because at the end of the
Mhm.
day, no one wants bad regulation. Like bad regulation makes our job harder. It can make platforms less safe, and it can make the challenges that we're facing that much more difficult to overcome in, creating better spaces online. And so whoever it is you're talking to, parents, comms, trust and safety, and the engineers, researchers, but have the conversation, try to understand as much as you can and figure out like what are the things that are within your control and what are the things that are not, but you can hopefully look for and understand to make sure that whatever platform you're on, you're getting the best experience for you that you want to get out of it.
And my wish for people would be for the general public and people outside of this space to follow the people in it, like on LinkedIn, you and Alice Hunsberger and Rachel Cohort and Jeff Dunn and all these people who kind of come to LinkedIn and maybe they have a Substack or a newsletter
Mm-hmm.
and they are talking about these things in ways that are super interesting. And that obviously it all, the trust and safety community is all helped by this information and it's incredible. And I wish the whole world could kind of see some of these people and the things that they say on LinkedIn because there's no better way to tell this story transparently than to hear from the people who are willing to tell the story of what it's actually like to make these really hard decisions every single day and look at all of these platforms and all of the many nuances and challenges and that. And I also don't believe it's their responsibility and they have to do it. But I think that the people who have chosen to need to be heard. And we need to give those people a platform and a spotlight and put them in front of journalists if they're willing. And because that is not easy. And it also, this trust and safety community has a lot to teach the world. So.
Yeah. Cassie, you have a podcast too.
I do, yes. My colleague Paylez and I host Safe Space. It is a podcast that really is designed to show the human side of trust and safety, which really aligns with the conversation we had today. We have some really good guests this season, and you can find Safe Space on really anywhere you get podcasts, Spotify, Apple, all of those.
No, and if you love trust and safety, I encourage you to check it out because it looks at trust and safety across different issues, whether you're working in dating apps or in-person apps, like DoorDash delivery, renting cars, to child safety across the board, and all the harms that we potentially can experience as human in those spaces are all different. So understanding those areas are fascinating for those in the trust and safety.
Yeah, it's been really fun.
Yeah, I would love to do that. That'd be awesome. Cassie, for anyone who wants to learn more about you, Thorn, your work, where can they find more information?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. I think that's the best place. I'm posting too there all the time about these challenges and some other things that I think are interesting in the child safety space and the trust and safety world. I mean, if there's anything I could say, it's go to LinkedIn and kind of follow some of these people as well. And then, of course, to learn about Thorn and the ways that we're defending children from sexual abuse and exploitation in the digital age, you can visit thorn.org, and everything you need is there, including some tips for parents too, if that's something that you're interested in.
Hey, Cassie, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Most definitely. And thank you everyone for listening. Have a wonderful day.